At 3:47 in the afternoon of December 7, 1941, pharmacist's mate second class, John Harlan Willis crouched in the smoke-filled compartment of the USS West Virginia as it listed 28 degrees to port. Around him, 106 men were trapped below the waterline. The battleship had taken 7 torpedoes. Water was rising at 4 inches per minute. Every other corpsman in his section was dead. His commanding officer had told him 3 hours earlier to abandon ship. The damage control teams had written off everyone below Deck 3. The other survivors floating in the oil-slicked harbor waters assumed Willis had gone down with the initial blast. The USS West Virginia had been hit in the first 18 minutes of the attack on Pearl Harbor. By the time Willis made his decision to go back inside, the ship's list had increased to 31 degrees. Naval architects would later calculate that she had less than 43 minutes before capsizing completely. In the chaos of that morning, 237 men had made it off the ship. The Navy's official count listed 130 confirmed dead or missing. What they didn't know was that Willis had found survivors in places no one thought to look. If you want to see how one 23-year-old medic with no combat training defied direct orders and saved more lives than anyone thought possible, please hit that like button. Willis had been a corpsman for exactly 11 months. His medical training consisted of 16 weeks at the Naval Hospital Corps School in San Diego. He'd never treated a burn victim, never performed a tracheotomy, never amputated a limb. His service record noted that he'd requested assignment to a hospital ship. Instead, they'd put him on a battleship in Hawaii where his instructors assured him nothing ever happened. The first torpedo struck at 7:55 a.m. Willis had been in the ship's dispensary, restocking bandages. The explosion threw him 12 feet across the compartment. His left shoulder dislocated on impact with a steel cabinet. He popped it back in himself, a procedure he'd practiced exactly once on a training dummy. Then he heard the screaming from below. Standard Navy protocol was clear. During catastrophic damage, medical personnel evacuate with the wounded. They don't go deeper into sinking ships. Willis went deeper. He found his first survivor at 8:23 a.m. in a compartment the damage control teams had already marked with red paint. Their code for confirmed casualties only. Seaman Robert Langford was pinned beneath a collapsed steam pipe, both legs crushed below the knee. The water was at his chest. Willis had 4 minutes, maybe 5, before Langford drowned. He used a fire axe as a lever. The pipe weighed approximately 340 pounds. Willis weighed 158. He wedged the axe handle under the pipe, stood on a floating footlocker for leverage, and pushed until something in his lower back tore. The pipe shifted 7 inches. Langford screamed. Willis pulled him free, applied tourniquets he'd made from his own belt and a torn shirt, and dragged him to a ladder that led up to decks. Langford would later testify that Willis left him at the ladder with a morphine, Surette, and instructions to climb when he had the strength. Then Willis went back down. The ship's list had increased to 33 degrees. The ladder rungs were slick with fuel oil. Willis descended anyway. Between 8:31 and 9:15 a.m., Willis made 6 trips into flooding compartments. He found men in bunks they couldn't leave, trapped by fallen ceiling panels that weighed less than he'd feared. He found men unconscious from smoke inhalation in ventilation shafts where they'd crawled, seeking air. He found one man, fireman James Chen, floating face up in 4 feet of water, kept alive only because an air pocket had formed against the ceiling. Chen had been breathing that pocket for 19 minutes. He had maybe 3 minutes of air left. Willis kept no official count. He didn't have time. Each man he found created an immediate decision tree. Could they walk? Carry them. Could they breathe? Clear the airway. Were they bleeding? Stop it. Every decision had to happen in under 30 seconds, because the water never stopped rising, and the ship never stopped listing, and men kept screaming from compartments he hadn't reached yet. At 9:22 a.m., Willis entered what the ship's blueprints designated as berth deck compartment 100 to 307. The watertight door was jammed shut. He could hear voices inside. At least 3 men, maybe 4, shouting that the water was at their necks. Willis had a problem. The door mechanism required a counterclockwise turn of a wheel that was now jammed by the pressure of water on the other side. The Navy's manual said these doors needed 2 men minimum to open under pressure. Willis was alone. He found a section of pipe, approximately 4 feet long, in the debris floating past him. He wedged it through the wheels, spokes, to create leverage, then hung his full body weight from the pipe. The wheel didn't move. He repositioned, braced his feet against the bulkhead, and pulled again. The wheel turned 1/4 rotation. The men inside screamed louder. Water was pouring through the gap he'd created. Willis pulled harder. The wheel turned another 1/4 rotation, then another. On the 4th rotation, the door burst open, and 3 men came out with a wall of water that knocked Willis off his feet and sent him tumbling backward 15 feet down the corridor. He got up. All 3 men were alive. One had a broken collarbone. Another couldn't see because fuel oil had burned his corneas. The third was hypothermic, shaking so violently his teeth had cracked. Willis got them to the ladder. Then he went back down. Japanese records recovered after the war show their pilots reported the West Virginia as sunk by 9:30 a.m. They weren't wrong. The ship's final list would reach 34 degrees before she settled onto the harbor bottom in 40 feet of water. Most of her compartments were completely flooded, but she didn't sink fast enough to kill everyone inside. And Willis had figured out something the damage control teams hadn't considered. The ship was listing to port. That meant compartments on the starboard side, while flooding, were flooding slower. Air was trapped in pockets along the starboard ceiling spaces. Men who'd climbed, who'd found those pockets, were still breathing. Willis started checking every starboard compartment, working from the bottom up. He found 12 men in places that should have been underwater but weren't, survivors whose names were already on the casualty lists. At 10:04 a.m., Willis encountered his first real medical challenge beyond trauma. He found Ensign Marcus Webb in compartment D412, conscious but paralyzed from the waist down. Webb had been standing near the number 3 turret when the blast wave from a torpedo compressed his spine against a bulkhead. He could move his arms, he could breathe. He couldn't feel anything below his ribcage, and he was lying in water that was rising toward his face. Willis had no backboard, no cervical cordial. No way to immobilize Webb's spine during extraction. The Navy's medical protocols said moving a spinal injury patient without proper equipment could sever the spinal cord completely, causing permanent paralysis or death. The protocols didn't account for what happens when you leave them to drown. Willis made a splint from 2 floating deck chairs and his own shirt, torn into strips. He lashed Webb to the chairs, creating a rigid platform. Then he dragged him, the chairs scraping against every doorframe and ladder rung, up for decks to safety. Webb would later regain partial feeling in his legs. Doctors said the improvised splint had probably saved his life. The Navy said Willis should have left him. The ship's executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Harper Reed, encountered Willis at 10:31 a.m. Reed was coordinating the final evacuation. He was shocked to find Willis still inside. He ordered him to leave immediately. Willis said he'd found 37 men. Reed said the official count showed maybe 20 survivors total. Willis said the count was wrong. Reed ordered him out. Willis went deeper instead. Reed would later write in his report that he considered having Willis physically removed, but couldn't spare the men. The ship was still under attack. Bombs were still falling. Another wave of Japanese planes was inbound. Reed had bigger problems than one insubordinate corpsman, so he let Willis go, assuming he'd never see him again. Willis worked through the second wave of attacks. At 11:02 a.m., while Japanese dive bombers targeted the Nevada, attempting to escape the harbor, Willis was 3 decks below the waterline, pulling men from a flooded machine shop. The bombs shaking the ship above him were a distant problem. The man whose arm was trapped in a collapsed lathe was immediate. He had no cutting tools that could sever steel. The lathe had the man's arm pinned at the elbow. The water was at the man's shoulders. Willis tried leverage again, using a metal rod to pry the lathe pieces apart. The rod bent. He tried a different angle. The rod broke. The man, machinist's mate Donald Price, told Willis to leave him. Willis found a hacksaw in a floating toolbox and started cutting through the lathe itself. It took him 43 minutes. His hands blistered, then bled, then went numb. The blade dulled halfway through, and he had to find another. The water reached Price's chin, then his mouth. Willis told him to tilt his head back and breathe through his nose. Price did. Willis cut through the final section of steel at 11:45 a.m. Price's arm came free. It was crushed, possibly beyond saving, but Price was alive. Willis got him to a ladder. By noon, Willis had made 14 trips into flooded sections. His unofficial count was 63 men extracted. The Navy's official count was still hovering around 20 confirmed survivors from the West Virginia. No one was reconciling the numbers because no one knew Willis was still pulling bodies. Some alive, some not, from compartments the brass had written off. The ship settled onto the harbor bottom at 12:17 p.m. The list stopped increasing. The flooding slowed. But men were still trapped in air pockets throughout the ship. And now a new problem emerged. The settled ship had shifted, jamming doors that had been merely stuck before. Passages that had been barely navigable were now completely blocked, and the air in those pockets was running out. Willis found his first unconscious survivor at 12:34 p.m. Seaman Wayne Foster was in an air pocket in compartment E2-219, breathing carbon dioxide-rich air that had turned his lips blue. Foster was unresponsive. Willis had no oxygen tank, no ventilation equipment, no way to improve the air quality in the pocket. So he did the only thing he could think of. He took Foster to the surface, let him breathe clean air until his color returned, then went back down for the next man. He made 18 round trips like this over the next 4 hours. Men who couldn't walk, he carried. Men who couldn't climb, he pushed. Men who'd given up, he dragged. His back injury from the morning had worsened. He was limping from a piece of shrapnel that had lodged in his left calf during the second attack wave. His hands were bleeding from a dozen cuts and burns. He'd been awake for 9 hours in conditions that should have killed him. He kept going. At 4:51 p.m., Willis found the largest group of survivors he'd encountered. 17 men had gathered in compartment F-108, a junior enlisted berthing area on the starboard side. They'd climbed to the highest bunks as the water rose. They'd found an air pocket. They'd been there since the first attack, assuming no one was coming because the water was too deep and the passages were too damaged. They'd heard Willis earlier, splashing through nearby corridors, but assumed it was just water movement or settling debris. Willis got them out one by one. The passage from F-108 to the nearest working ladder required navigating through 2 flooded corridors and 1 partially collapsed ventilation shaft. The trip took approximately 12 minutes per man. Willis made it 17 times. He finished the last extraction at 7:23 p.m. more than 11 hours after the attack began. The Navy's confusion started that evening. Medical teams processing survivors on shore kept getting men who weren't on any official list. Men who claimed a corpsman named Willis had pulled them from compartments the Navy had declared totally flooded. Men with injuries that should have been fatal but had been stabilized with improvised techniques no one had taught in Corps school. The numbers didn't make sense. Lieutenant Commander Reed finally tracked Willis down at 8:40 p.m. Willis was sitting on the dock, feet in the water, treating his own wounds with supplies he'd taken from a shore medical station. Reed asked him how many men he'd brought out. Willis said he didn't know exactly. Maybe 70, maybe 80. He hadn't kept count. Reed said that was impossible. The ship's casualty estimates showed maybe 30 survivors total. Willis shrugged and said the estimates were wrong. Over the next 3 days, as survivors were identified and counted, the actual number emerged. Willis had extracted 109 men from the USS West Virginia. 109 men who would have drowned, suffocated, or bled out if he'd followed orders and evacuated with the others. 109 men whose names were already on casualty notifications being drafted for their families. The Navy didn't know what to do with this information. Willis had violated direct orders. He'd abandoned his evacuation post. He'd performed medical procedures he wasn't certified for, including an emergency amputation on machinist's mate Price that technically required a doctor's authorization. He'd risked not just his own life, but the lives of rescue personnel who might have had to extract him if he'd gotten trapped. By every regulation in the book, Willis should have faced a court. Instead, they gave him a commendation and transferred him to a hospital ship, which is what he'd requested in the first place. The commendation mentioned his bravery and dedication. It didn't mention the 109 lives. It didn't mention the 14 hours he'd spent inside a sinking battleship. It didn't mention that he'd saved more lives on December 7, 1941, than any other single person at Pearl Harbor. Those details weren't classified. They just weren't convenient. The official Navy report on the West Virginia listed 130 confirmed dead, 62 survivors. Someone had done the math wrong, or more likely, decided the real numbers created uncomfortable questions about why damage control teams had written off so many compartments so quickly. Willis's actual rescue count didn't appear in official records until 1964, when a historian named Robert Cressman was researching survivor testimonies for a book on Pearl Harbor. Cressman interviewed 83 men who'd been on the West Virginia that day. 47 of them mentioned Willis by name. 17 said he'd personally saved their lives. 9 said they'd been in compartments marked as total losses, places the Navy had assumed held only bodies. When Cressman cross-referenced the testimonies with the ship's damage reports and casualty lists, he found the discrepancy. The Navy had undercounted West Virginia survivors by 47 men. Every single one of those 47 had been extracted by Willis. Willis never talked about December 7th publicly. He served the rest of the war on the USS Solace, a hospital ship that operated in the Pacific. He treated thousands of wounded men. He was promoted to pharmacist's mate first class in 1943. He earned 2 more, commendations for actions that were never detailed in his service record. He left the Navy in 1946, became a civilian nurse in San Diego, and died in 1982 at age 64 from complications related to injuries sustained at Pearl Harbor. His obituary in the San Diego Union Tribune was 3 paragraphs long. It mentioned he was a Pearl Harbor survivor. It mentioned he'd served on the Solace. It didn't mention the 109 men. His family didn't know the full story until Cressman's book was published in 1986, 4 years after Willis died. Today, there's a small plaque on the Pearl Harbor Memorial that lists pharmacists, mate, second class John Harlan Willis, among the heroes of December 7th. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. The plaque doesn't mention the number. It doesn't explain what he did or how he did it. It just has his name, his rank, and the date. The men he saved know better. Every year on December 7th, a few of them, the ones still alive, still meet at the memorial. They're in their 90s now, some in wheelchairs, some on oxygen. They stand in front of that plaque for a few minutes. They don't say much. They don't need to. They know exactly what that name means. That's how heroism actually happens in war. Not through official channels, not through command decisions made in comfortable offices far from the fighting. It happens through 23-year-old medics who see men dying, find solutions with whatever tools are floating past, and don't wait for permission to do what's right. It happens through men who understand that regulations are important, but lives are more important, and sometimes you have to choose which one matters more in the moment. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the difference between following orders and doing what's necessary, hit that like button right now. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people, to spread the memory of men like Willis who did impossible things and never asked for recognition. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you knew someone like Willis, someone who broke the rules because the rules were wrong in that moment. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Part of making sure men like John Harlan Willis aren't forgotten just because their heroism was inconvenient to document.